Have you ever felt that even when seeking answers in the Bible, some things still don't seem to fit? Maybe you've wondered why there are so many different interpretations of something that should be so clear. This confusion can be frustrating and sometimes even drive you away from the peace you seek in your walk with God. But today, we're going to put an end to these doubts. In this video, I will guide you along a path of clarity, revealing truths that are often overlooked. We'll talk about God's commandments, grace, and how these two things come together to transform your life. And it doesn't stop there. At the end, I have a special challenge for you, an invitation that few can accept, but that can completely change your perspective on what it means to live a true faith. So stay with me until the end. Don't let distractions take you away from what God has prepared for this moment. Because the final part of this video might be exactly what you needed to align your life with God's purpose. Have you ever stopped to think how a simple text can carry such a profound message? In Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 and 25, we find one of those passages that seem straightforward, but when understood, lead us to reflect on how God has been acting in our lives. God's law, described by Paul as a guardian, is more than just a rule. This term, coming from Greek, describes a figure who cared for children, teaching them and correcting them until they were ready to follow the path on their own. Imagine the strength of that. Before Christ came, the law was what guided us, pointed out our mistakes, and showed us what was right. It served as a way to prepare us, to show us how much we needed something greater. But when Christ came, that function changed. The message of the cross transformed the role of the law. It ceased to be a burden or a constant correction and became something that pulses within us. Instead of relying on stone tablets or texts that only pointed out errors, God inscribed the law on our hearts. This is powerful because it's no longer about the fear of making mistakes, but about the desire to please. Here lies the beauty of it all. Living by faith doesn't mean ignoring the law, but living it in a deeper way, guided by love and grace. When Paul says that the guardian is no longer necessary, he's not saying that everything has been discarded. He is showing us that we now live more fully, not out of fear of punishment, but because we choose to reflect Christ's character in our actions. This message is an invitation to rethink our relationship with the law and grace. Many interpret Galatians 3 as a justification to discard the 10 Commandments. But is that really the case? Without the law, how would we know what sin is? Paul himself states in Romans that the law is like a mirror, revealing our errors and helping us seek forgiveness in Christ. Now the question remains, how can we live this in practice? It's not about following rules blindly, but about choosing to live in alignment with what God has placed within us. This challenges us to love more, forgive more, and be more just. It's not about perfection, but about intention and surrender. And here's the most important point. Don't fall into the idea that grace eliminates the need to live a righteous life. Grace is what gives us the strength to move forward, but the law remains a guide that helps us understand what is right. It's as if God has given us a map so we don't get lost in a world full of shortcuts that lead to emptiness. And you, how have you perceived this message? Had you thought that God's law is not a burden, but a reflection of His love for us? If this idea is clearing something in your mind, share your experience. I want to hear what you think about it, because this exchange is essential for us to grow together. The function of the law has been transformed, but never discarded. It's time to live with the certainty that, guided by faith, we are closer to reflecting God's character. Now that we've seen how Galatians 3:24-25 reveals the transformative role of the law, written on our hearts through Christ, a fundamental question arises. Why do so many churches distort this clear teaching? Unfortunately, we live in times where many have used isolated texts from the Bible to spread ideas that distance people from God's true message. And this not only confuses but also diverts the faith of those who seek to live according to the Word. If you've ever felt lost or even deceived by messages that seem liberating but actually distort God's commandments, this is the moment to seek the truth. In the next point, we'll explore the dangers of false teachings about the law and how these errors can put your spiritual life at risk. And if you want to go further in understanding the Bible and strengthening your faith, I've provided exclusive material in the first pinned comment of this video. It's content that will open your eyes to truths that often go unnoticed. Don't leave it for later, because these answers can transform the way you live your faith. Now, let's discover together how these distortions can take us away from God's purpose. Have you ever thought about how some messages that seem to bring freedom can in fact imprison? When we talk about God's law, some say it no longer matters. This idea, disguised as truth, hides one of the greatest spiritual traps, making you believe that grace eliminates the need to live in obedience. This teaching has seduced many people. It's presented in an attractive way, as if simply trusting in faith was enough and nothing else mattered. It seems simple, doesn't it? But that's exactly where the danger lies. Without the law, how would you know what is wrong? Paul explains in Romans that the law is like a mirror showing where we are failing. It doesn't save us, but it guides us, revealing where we need God's grace. Now think with me, why would someone distort something so clear? It's not hard to imagine that the goal is to confuse. These churches take advantage of isolated texts, like Galatians chapter 3, to argue that the commandments are irrelevant. But is that really what the Bible teaches? Look at what Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Doesn't it seem contradictory to think that he discarded what he asked us to follow? This view that tries to separate faith from obedience leaves us vulnerable. It's like walking down a road without traffic signs. Without direction, you don't know where to go, and the risk of getting lost is high. The law shows us the way, while grace gives us the strength to walk it. Separating these two things is like trying to walk without a clear purpose. Furthermore, there is something even more alarming. Many of these messages not only minimize the law, but replace it with human traditions. Have you noticed how some groups insist on rules that aren't even in the Bible while ignoring the Ten Commandments? This happens because it's more convenient to shape teaching to what is popular rather than maintain fidelity to what God has taught us. And what about the Sabbath, for example? It is one of the commandments that has been most neglected. Some say it has been replaced by another day, or that it no longer holds relevance. But where is this in the scriptures? The truth is that the change did not come from God, but from religious leaders who tried to mold the teachings to fit traditions. Therefore, it is essential that you look beyond what is preached from some pulpits. Not everything said in the name of spiritual freedom reflects what God has planned for us. Obedience and faith go hand in hand. Without one, the other loses its meaning. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you heard this type of message? Has it made you rethink what you believe? Share in the comments what you are feeling or thinking. Let's talk about it, because this space is for you to seek answers and strengthen your spiritual walk. The truth sets you free, but we need to stay vigilant. Don't let distorted teachings lead you away from the path that leads to a full life with God. Let's talk about something that often goes unnoticed. Jesus, with all his wisdom, summarized the commandments into two pillars that uphold everything: loving God and loving your neighbor. It seems simple, but what does it truly mean? The Ten Commandments are not just a set of rules. They are a way to show what God expects from us. The first four teach us how to live this love with God. The first, for example, speaks about putting God above all else. It's not just about words, but about our choices. When we choose what brings us closer to Him, we are saying that He is the most important in our lives. Next comes the second, which instructs us not to create images or idols to worship. Today, this goes far beyond statues. It's about not letting anything, whether money, work, or even people, take the place that belongs to God. This care reflects our genuine devotion. The third commandment reminds us to respect the name of God. It's not just about how we speak, but how we live. When we act with integrity and demonstrate the values He teaches us, we are honoring His name. And the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, it asks us to set aside special time for God. It's not just about resting, but prioritizing a relationship with Him. It's a weekly reminder that we depend on Him for everything. Now, if we look at the other 6 commandments, we see how they turn towards others. Honoring your father and mother, for example, goes far beyond kind words. It's about caring for, respecting, and valuing those who gave us life. The commandment not to kill is also deeper than it seems. Jesus explained that even hatred is a form of destruction. This challenges us to cultivate patience and forgiveness, even when it's difficult. And what about fidelity in relationships? Not committing adultery means respecting commitments and valuing trust. It is protection for ourselves and for those we love. Next comes honesty. Not stealing and not lying are attitudes that show respect for what belongs to others and for the truth. When we follow this, we create healthier and more genuine relationships. Lastly, not coveting teaches us to be grateful. It's about finding joy in what we have without letting envy or the desire to have what others have poison our hearts. When Jesus summarized all this into loving God and loving your neighbor, He wasn't simplifying, but showing the essence of the commandments. It's not about following rules coldly, but about turning that love into action. Loving God is showing it in every choice. Loving your neighbor is about caring, respecting, and being just. And you, how have you been living this love? Share here how you apply the commandments in your daily life. This conversation is important for us to grow together. The commandments are not a burden, but a gift that helps us live better with God and with others. So far, we've talked about how the 10 commandments are the foundation of loving God and loving your neighbor. Each principle holds a meaning that goes beyond words, reflecting how our actions can honor God and transform our relationships. Now let me ask, had you ever thought about the commandments in this way, as something so deep and practical? If this is bringing new ideas to you, I want you to write in the comments which commandment you find most challenging to live today. Is it putting God above all else? Or perhaps the challenge of loving your neighbor in difficult situations? I want to hear your opinion, because this exchange is essential for us to delve even deeper into this topic. And speaking of commandments, did you know that the Sabbath holds a much greater meaning than just resting? It is a direct reminder of God's creation and our relationship with Him. In the next point, we will see why the Sabbath is so important from the beginning to eternity. Don't leave now, because what comes next may completely change the way you view this day that God has set apart. The Sabbath. Have you thought about the meaning of this day? Often, it is seen just as a moment of rest, but there is something much deeper behind it. When God finished creation, He set apart the 7th day as a memorial. It was not because He needed to rest, but to give us an example of balance and connection with Him. The first thing we can notice is that the Sabbath is a mark of God as our Creator. He is described in the Bible as a day He blessed and sanctified. It is not just any day. It is a moment for you to disconnect from the worries of the week and focus on what truly matters, your relationship with God. This pause, so necessary, helps us remember who we are and to whom we belong. Now, some say that the Sabbath has been replaced by another day, or that it no longer holds importance. But if we look at the scriptures, There is no indication that God has changed this. What happened was a cultural shift driven by human traditions. What God established as eternal remains relevant, even if many try to ignore it. Moreover, the Sabbath holds a meaning that goes beyond physical rest. It reflects trust in God as our provider. When we set aside our activities to dedicate time to Him, we are declaring that we trust Him to meet our needs. It is an act of faith that challenges us to prioritize what is eternal instead of getting lost in what is temporary. Another important thing is that the Sabbath connects us with the future. Isaiah says that in the new heavens and the new earth, Sabbath by Sabbath, all humanity will gather to worship God. This shows us that it was not only for the past or for a specific people, but for all who recognize God as Lord. Have you ever stopped to think how much this day can transform your life? Observing the Sabbath is much more than just a religious practice. It is a moment to create a closer relationship with God, strengthen bonds with your family, and find time to reflect on the direction your life is taking. And even if many question or dismiss the Sabbath, it remains a weekly reminder of what truly matters. No matter how the world changes or what traditions are created, what God has done remains. The Sabbath is an invitation, not just to stop, but to reconnect with God, with yourself, and with those you love. It is a moment to remember that, amidst the hustle, there is something greater calling us to slow down and find purpose. And you? How have you been approaching this day? Have you tried living it as God intended? Share your experience or thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about how the Sabbath can bring meaning to our lives. Have you ever thought about what it means to live under the new covenant? At first glance, it seems distant, but this promise from God is closer to us than we imagine. When we read in Jeremiah that God would make a new covenant, He was not talking about discarding His laws or creating something entirely new. He was showing a way to draw even closer to Him. The new covenant is not about forgetting what God established in the past. It is a continuity, a way to make God's law part of who we are. Instead of being written on stone tablets, as in Sinai, now this law is placed in our hearts and minds. This changes everything because it ceases to be something external, something imposed, and becomes something that transforms us from the inside out. When God says, "I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts," He is showing us that His will becomes a natural guide for our lives. It is not about following rules out of fear, but about living in a way that reflects the love we have for Him. And you know what is even more amazing? This new covenant is proof of how much God loves us. He does not expect perfection, but surrender. He understands that we are flawed and therefore offers us grace. But grace does not eliminate the importance of the law. On the contrary, it gives us the strength to live according to God's principles, even when we fail. This brings us to an important point. Often we hear that being under the new covenant means that the law has been abolished. But is that really the case? If God's laws are an expression of His character, how could they lose their value? Jesus clearly said that He did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. This means that by following Him, we live out the fullness of the law, not because we are obliged, but because it reflects what He has placed within us. Now think with me, how does this work in daily life? The new covenant calls us to live more consciously. It teaches us to view the commandments as something that guides us, protects us, and helps us live fully. It is not about following rules blindly, but about finding purpose in every choice. For example, when we choose not to lie, it is not just because it is written in a rule, but because we understand that it preserves trust and relationships. When we honor our parents, it is because we see the value of family and care. Each commandment gains a greater meaning because now it is linked to our love for God and for people. This new covenant invites us to live with intentionality, not because we are obliged, but because we choose. We choose to love, to forgive, to be honest, and to seek what is right. And you know what is better? God gives us the strength to do so. He does not just ask, He empowers us. Now I want to hear from you. What does this new covenant mean in your life? Does it make sense to you that the law is not a burden, but a way to live closer to God? Share in the comments, because this conversation can inspire others to reflect on their walk with Him. God has not changed His laws, but He has changed the way we connect with them. This is grace in action, and it is an opportunity for us to live more fully. We talked about the new covenant and how it does not discard God's laws, but makes them part of who we are, engraving them in our hearts and minds. This is proof of how much God wants to connect deeply with us, transforming our faith into something alive and meaningful. But unfortunately, there are many contradictions in the way some churches interpret the scriptures. The Old Testament, which should be a solid foundation, is often discarded or used only conveniently. Does this not make us lose something essential from God's message? In the next point, we will see how these contradictions affect our understanding of the Bible and what this means for those who seek to live with integrity. And before we continue, I want to invite you to download the special material that is in the first pinned comment. It is a resource that will help you understand even more deeply how to live this faith in alignment with God's Word. Don't leave it for later, because this is the moment to act and delve deeper. Now get ready, because what follows will challenge you to think in a completely new way about the value of the Old Testament. Have you noticed how some churches have a confusing relationship with the Old Testament? On one hand, they say it no longer has value, that it was something for the Jews, and that we live in a new reality. But on the other hand, they use selected passages when it is convenient for their own teachings. It is something that deserves careful analysis. Let's start with a clear example: tithing. How many times have you heard Malachi 3 being cited? Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. This verse is often used to justify the practice of tithing in today's churches. But here's the point. If the Old Testament has lost its value, as they say, why is this text still used? Doesn't it seem contradictory? Now think of another example. When we talk about the Ten Commandments, many teach that they are no longer necessary, that they were abolished on the cross. But how can this be true if Jesus Himself stated that He did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it? Discarding the commandments is rejecting the basic principles of God's character that they reflect. And what about the Sabbath? It is a fundamental part of the Ten Commandments, yet many completely ignore it. They claim it has been replaced by another day, or that it no longer holds relevance. But does that make sense? The Sabbath was instituted during creation, long before any nation or religious system existed. It was given as an eternal memorial and was never abolished by God. These contradictions go deeper. Some churches discard the entire Old Testament system, but do not hesitate to use the stories of characters like David, Moses, and Daniel to inspire and teach. Can we really separate these stories from the laws and principles they carry? The Old Testament is a unified whole, and rejecting part of it is also rejecting the context that gives meaning to these stories. Another important point is how these churches ignore the Old Testament prophecies that point to Jesus. Isaiah 53, for example, describes the Messiah's suffering in impressive detail. Without the Old Testament, it would be impossible to fully understand the purpose of Christ's life and death. So how can they discard it? The truth is that this selective attitude creates a fragmented theology. By ignoring what is inconvenient and using what reinforces their ideas, these churches end up weakening the Bible's complete message. God did not give us His word for us to choose only the parts we like. He gave us a whole, so we could see His redemption plan in every detail. And here lies the challenge. How have you been approaching the Old Testament? Do you see it as something distant, outdated, or as a foundation to understand what God is doing in the present. The entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, was written to teach, correct, and guide. We cannot ignore parts of it without losing the essence of its message. Share here what you think about this. Do you believe the Old Testament still holds value for our lives today? Let's talk about it, because understanding the Bible as a whole helps us live more aligned with what God has planned for us. Have you ever stopped to think how we will be seen in the last days? The Bible gives us a powerful description in Revelation 14:12. It speaks about a special group, a faithful people distinguished by two characteristics. They keep God's commandments and have faith in Jesus. This is the model we should strive for, not out of fear, but by choice and love. When we look at God's commandments, we realize they are not just rules. They reflect His character, showing what is important to Him and how we should live. Keeping these commandments is much more than following a list. It is allowing God's will to be evident in everything we do. And here is the main point. The faithful people of the last days are not identified solely by obedience. They also have faith in Jesus. This combination is what makes them unique. Obedience without faith can lead to legalism, and faith without obedience can become superficial. It is the union of these two things that makes God's people stand out. But what does it mean to keep God's commandments today? It means living a life of integrity, love, and respect. It is putting God first, honoring the people around us, and always striving to do what is right. This does not mean we are perfect, but that we choose daily to align our actions with God's will. Now, what about faith in Jesus? It is not just believing that He exists. It is trusting Him to the point of surrendering our lives into His hands. This faith moves us, transforms us, and gives us the courage to face the challenges of a world that often goes in the opposite direction. Do you see how these two things are connected? It is faith that gives us the strength to obey, and obedience is a testament to how much we trust in Jesus. This is the essence of the faithful people of the last days. They live with purpose because they know their lives reflect something greater. And now I want to propose a challenge for you. Look at your life today and ask yourself, would you be recognized as part of this faithful people? Have you been keeping God's commandments and trusting in Jesus with all your heart? Write here in the comments what you think you need to change or strengthen so that these characteristics are more present in your daily life. This reflection is not just for thinking and forgetting, it is an invitation to act. If there is something you know you can do differently, start now. It is not about perfection, but about intention. God looks at the heart, and He honors those who choose to follow Him sincerely. Share your response and what is in your heart. Let's create a real conversation here, because each person who participates can inspire others to seek more of God and live according to His will. In the end, what really matters is being ready. Not because we know the day or the hour, but because we live each moment as an opportunity to draw closer to God. Be part of the people who make a difference. Now that we have seen how the faithful people are identified in the last days, with true faith in Jesus and a genuine commitment to keep God's commandments, the final question is, are you part of this people? If this topic has moved you, share your answer in the comments. I want to know how it has impacted the way you think and live your faith. Before you go, I have 2 essential videos for you to continue deepening your knowledge and strengthening your spiritual walk. They are appearing on the screen now, and I highly recommend that you watch both. They complement everything we have discussed here and can answer other questions you may have. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take this moment to click the subscribe button and activate the notification bell. This way you won't miss any of the upcoming videos that will bring even more insights to your spiritual life. Also, don't forget to like this video because it greatly helps reach more people. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share it right now. It might be that what you are sharing is exactly what this person needs at this moment. Thank you for watching this far. May God bless your life and see you in the next videos.